UX Podcast is funded by James and myself, together with any contributions we can get from you, our listeners. You can contribute any amount you like, whenever you like, by visiting uxpodcast.com/support.
UX Podcast Episode 228.
Hello, I'm Pat Axbo.
And I'm James Royal Lawson.
And this is UX Podcast. We're in Stockholm, Sweden, and you're listening in all 50 states of the USA from South Carolina to North Dakota.
And today is time for a link show. We have two articles for you that Per and I have stumbled upon, staggered over, and read recently. And
during our digital travels.
You normally do say that during our digital
travels. We always have to say that.
Digital travels during the festive period. So,
right.
The two articles are the Aesthetic Accessibility Paradox by Anthony Zeng on UX Movement.
And the second article is 3 Principles for Designing Machine Learning-Powered Products by Matt Budelman and Mark Kizzelstein.
They work at Spotify Design.
But let's start off with the aesthetic accessibility paradox, because I think we have a lot of feelings about this, and I think one challenge here is not to get too involved and emotional in some of the ways that the author expresses how he looks upon accessibility, because we can read the article and you can look at the comments. The comment section is quite revealing as well. But let's start off with what this is about. So there's essentially, according to the author, a conflict between making something visually appealing and making it accessible for just everyone. And he goes on to describe this using vision as the example. So in the first paragraph, he claims that the majority of users usually have normal vision, is his sentence there, while the minority have some form of visual impairment. And so the struggle here is that if you actually don't have a visual impairment, he says, then you want it visually appealing. But if you want it accessible, it won't be visually appealing for the majority of users, which will make it a worse experience for those people.
A lesser design.
That is the essential argument. Exactly.
But first off, though, we've got to query the majority and normal vision part of this.
Yeah, let's start off by questioning that assertion in the first paragraph. The majority of users usually have normal vision.
Now, I think that's quite true.
Yeah.
But I'll say that with a star next to it, because when we're talking about the minority that do have a visual impairment, the World Health Organization, they've recently claimed or said that over 2.2 billion people worldwide have a visual impairment, treated or untreated.
And in that case, it actually is the minority then. It's 2.2 billion, but it's a minority.
It's not a minority to sniff at, because 2.2 billion people is a lot.
Yeah. What I did, though, was actually I found a study from 2005 that tells us more. It's from Jobs on Research. Tells us more about the state of vision impairment in the USA. And according to this study, over 61% of the population, or 177 million people in the US, need some sort of vision correction. And that, to me, sounds like there's actually a majority who do not have normal vision. We could also start talking about, we can't get into specifically everything, but why would you call it normal vision? Why is it normal if it's not necessarily the majority, as it is found by this study?
Yeah, there's problems with that phrase normal, because it's normal from a certain perspective.
Which implies that something else would be abnormal. But there's another interesting figure from this study. 12.2 million adults require some sort of vision correction but don't use any. So you might require glasses, but you don't use it. 12.2 million adults in the U.S. alone.
So But if we're moving on from...
We're talking about a lot of people.
We are talking on a lot of people, but if we're moving on from the stats of visual impairment, one of the quotes from the article is, in general, the more accessible an interface is, the less aesthetic appeal it will have. Now, I just don't know where to begin with that sentence, because, I mean, how do you claim that? I mean, how can you claim that if an interface is accessible, say made to be fully inclusive, that it's ugly?
Right.
Look, the crux of this, I guess, is you've got one thing, aesthetics, which is, in my opinion, subjective. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's entirely subjective. It's what you think. And then we've got accessibility, which, to a large extent, is something objective.
Right.
You
can measure if somebody has access to the solution or not.
Yeah, and on many aspects of accessibility, you can literally say yes or no. It can do that. You can do that. You can access that. You can't do that. You can't do that. And even with colours, I know this can be a bit of a contentious topic as well, but you can measure contrast. You can measure readability. There are ways of actually measuring whether something is likely to be accessible from a colour perspective. When it comes from
what we're saying really is that two versions that are very aesthetically pleasing for some people, because we know it's subjective. One of those could be inaccessible, one of it could be accessible, but you can't tell by just looking at it whether it is.
Yeah.
You actually have to do the due diligence of finding it out.
Yeah, and I think how do you measure that aesthetic side of things? I mean, to decide whether your design is highly aesthetic would require a large amount of research to basically find, to interview people and to specifically question lay the question to them about beauty, define beauty. Philosophers have been trying to define beauty for thousands of years, and no one has completely managed to do it. So how the devil are you going to manage to go out there and interview someone to get an actual result on a checkbox of whether your site or design is actually beautiful or not? We can't get there. As a bit of fun, I actually asked my 11-year-old, I showed him this in the beginning of the article. There's a couple of pictures of a form on a website, simple sign-up form, and they're compared side by side. And one of them is actually marked as highly accessible, and it does look more contrast heavy. And then the other one is marked as highly aesthetic, and it looks a bit. It's less contrast, absolutely, compared to the one on the left. So I asked my 11-year-old, which one do you like best, and showed him them. He won't understand he wouldn't really bother reading the marking underneath. And he goes, that one, and points to the highly accessible one. So I said, why? And he goes, because you can see it better. The other one is just grey.
Right.
Now, what I think was fascinating about that is, I mean, he did an aesthetic evaluation of these two pictures spontaneously without prompt. He just kind of I threw them at him and said, and he chose the highly accessible one. Exactly. Now, Anthony in the article goes on. He shows a third one just below the fold on that one, which is and reveals that the two first pictures, one of them is AA compliant according to WCAG, WACG, and the other one was non-compliant.
Right.
So the AAA versus non-compliant, and then he goes on to show a AA compliant example and says this one is the balance.
And I think that's what upsets me most about this article is that it's misleading in a lot of ways. It misleads in the sense that aesthetics is subjective. What is more accessible could be more aesthetically pleasing for a lot of people. There's no evidence presented that that would not be the case. He asserts that when it's aesthetically pleasing, it's harsh for people who have accessibility needs. And he says, contrarian to that if it's highly accessible, that it's very harsh for people who have normal vision. I'm
yes,
doing finger quotes.
the quote here is
and there's no evidence for that assertion either.
And the quote here is that, however, your design will alienate normal visioned users who make up the majority of your user base. Oh. I mean, all this goes completely against the whole idea of inclusive design, and promotes the idea that you should only ever focus on the majority, really. Because even though under the surface he's saying, oh, there is a bit of a compromise. It's a compromise that's just, at best, what he's promoting is a compromise that's just a little bit of recognition to the minority. But we're not going to really worry about them.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Then you can't even compare those two needs, because if you have a preference for a certain aesthetic, that's very different from having a legitimate access need. Mm-hmm. If it's not aesthetically pleasing, but you can still use it, and more people can use it, that's more legitimate than designing for aesthetically pleasing and less people can use it. It just doesn't make any sense. Because, and I also have, I reacted to early on also this phrase: the goal of accessibility is to meet the needs of the minority because they're often forgotten. How is that the goal of accessibility? The goal of accessibility is to understand, when you see every one of us as human beings with a right to information, to understand how you accommodate those people, or the most number of people. It's not because they're often forgotten. It's because we see them as human beings.
Yeah,
I think that's what makes it emotional for me, because there are so many things in this that actually almost are offensive to a lot of people. But if you assert that, you are called an extremist. You are called an accessibility extremist or accessibility snowflake,
yes.
as the original tweet said.
Yeah.
And of course, it is intended to provoke. That's how I feel about this article. And even so, and the problem with these types of articles, of course, then there's always something in it that is correct. Yes, strive for AA. AAA is not always what you strive for, but also you can have the high contrast can be behind another button. I don't always approve of that, but some statements in the Web Content Accessibility Guidance could be interpreted that way. That's a good way to make a high contrast version behind another button. But so there are some things that are right, but it's presented in a way that the article itself actually misleads and alienates people.
And I'd go further to say, I mean, I completely agree with you that this article clearly is trying to provoke people, but I don't think it's just provoking. I think it's dangerous because of exactly what you're saying. That it's painting out things. It's laying things out to many people as a reasoned argument, and on the surface, some of these things come out, believable and correct. You could argue, but it does such a disservice to so many aspects of how we should be working. And I think it's just dangerous to suggest that there is an aesthetic accessibility paradox. I mean, they aren't two things that are in constant battle with each other. They are not. No. They shouldn't be. They don't have to be. And if you put them up against each other, then you're doing something wrong. And this article is wrong. I mean, right. I mean, it does. I think some of the comments go on about there being a trade-off. That we're always in situations where we have to make design trade-offs. And that is actually true. Well, I mean, what we do is hard. The business environments or the organizations we work in are often very challenging. And lots of people have very strong opinions. And, you don't get your point across at every corner. You don't even maybe have all the knowledge that you need at all the points. We get stuff wrong. We need to do stuff again, and so on. So you will make trade-offs, but it'd be really good if you do make a trade-off, then you do it in situations where you're happy with it and you've made a conscious, informed decision. So you understand the harm that you could be causing.
Exactly. Understanding that is key. Documenting it is key. Being able to motivate that decision to others is key. All of that. I had a quote I wanted to read from the comments from a colorblind person. This article makes me feel like I am the problem for being colorblind, and I really understand where he's coming from when he says that. And I have another quote from another accessibility article that I'll put in the show notes. Accessibility drives aesthetics because the ability to use something is beautiful.
Oh,
and I just love that quote because that's what it's all about.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually probably a good point to wrap up on the first article.
It probably is. So moving on, 3 principles for designing ML-powered products.
ML?
And if you don't know what ML, exactly, machine learning-powered products. And kudos to the authors here for not just throwing out the phrase AI. I love that.
Yeah.
But also not so good putting that abbreviation there.
No, they explain it in the first sentence. So.
Well, yeah, they do it in the first sentence. You're right.
Yeah. I'm not complaining about it. But it's Matt Budelman and... how did you pronounce this? Mark's surname.
I'm saying Kisselstein or Kisselstein.
Kisselstein. We could do we should do a separate podcast at some point with teach James how to pronounce names.
Exactly.
But they both work for Spotify Design. And the article goes through the design process behind some of the machine learning driven features of Spotify, such as the Discover Weekly playlist and the start page or the home section of the Spotify app.
And their first point.
Oh, should we list all 3 straight off, so people kind of like
do it?
Yeah,
do
okay.
It.
So the 3, so these 3 principles for designing machine learning powered products, according to Spotify Design, are: identify friction and automate it away, ask the right questions, and go manual before you go magical.
Which on their own maybe won't say so much. You actually have to read on to understand what each point is about. And you told me I would react to the first point, and of course I did, because it uses the word friction, which is one of my pet peeves. Identify friction and automate it away, because every designer understands that we always have to reduce friction as much as possible. But of course, listeners to this show will know that I argue a lot for the addition of friction where it's relevant to actually help people make better decisions.
Well, also not just the addition of friction, Barry. I mean, I think we've argued over the years. Just that whole thing of checking about the need for friction. I mean, sometimes rather checking for the need of removing it. Well, you're saying about adding it, which is also a valid point. But you also kind of really have to think, what happens when I remove friction?
Yeah, but exactly. But the friction has a place. It has its own. There's a reason friction helps us drive on roads, because otherwise we would slip off.
Yep.
So that makes sense in all actually all professions and industries.
Yeah.
So that's why I actually object to their example of reducing friction, because their example of reducing friction is about, instead of waiting 2 minutes to download a specific song, Spotify users could immediately play any song, anytime, anywhere. And that is sort of the success story of Spotify, that they actually were able to accomplish that much earlier than anyone else could do it online. And of course, that is what Spotify is all about.
Kind of.
Listen to music.
Kind of, but I when I read this, I get kind of, my brain starts wandering off, and I'm thinking, God, if that's Spotify's goal to kind of Spotify will play music anytime, anywhere, removing all friction, then it would just start blaring out music whenever I came near the Spotify app. I wouldn't even need to touch anything. It would just be constantly screaming music at me. That wouldn't be a good experience. Yeah. And I think that is more the point they're trying to make. I think they've just glossed over that aspect of it, that they do really want to have a good experience. So they are promoting that you find friction in the form of things that are hindering in a negative way what you want to achieve with the app. And
exactly, because they have friction, because they actually have buttons to control the music, and they actually do have pauses between each played track. So there is friction that they have. They just don't maybe not acknowledge it as friction always. But I'm not being entirely fair here either, because they actually do define friction as anywhere in the user experience where a human struggles in pursuit of their goals. So you actually have to figure out the goals first before you decide to reduce friction.
Yeah, and ultimately you'd want to check to make sure those goals are actually healthy goals or fair goals, because you don't want to necessarily support all users in all their goals.
But I also wonder sometimes, when I was thinking about this when I was reading about Discover Weekly, it's not something I use, but I understand that people really appreciate it. But doesn't that, if you always use Discover Weekly, you've always given the power to someone else to decide for you what songs you're going to discover. You never actually sit down and put that effort into discovering music yourself. You just sort of rely on that machine learning process to do it for you.
A little bit, although of course it needs the songs you play from Discover Weekly are not used to generate Discover Weekly, so you've got to listen to stuff outside of that playlist to allow that playlist to be generated effectively.
And that's an excellent point, because that actually brings us into what they're saying at the end here. What I really like about it is that it's a combination of augmentation and automation. You have to decide what to automate, and you have to decide what you augment, and also, of course, what still has to stay manual. So that balance always has to be there, and I like that they acknowledge that.
Exactly. This is one of the main points about this, that it's identify friction, automate it away when it's suitable to automate it, and don't automate it away completely. So they really are pushing the thing about enhancement and augmentation and reducing friction. So they are actually, I think, tying into what you said about they're not trying to remove friction completely. They are just really trying to make a better user experience. Which is so as far as the first principle of designing a machine learning powered product. This is actually a pretty good principle. So we're agreeing with the principle.
Absolutely.
I think similar thing for the second principle. Ask the right questions. They start off this section by quoting Picasso. Computers are useless. They can only give you answers. Which is it's wonderfully philosophical statement. You can't give the right answer unless you've understood the question, and that's essential with machine learning too.
I like that, yeah.
When you're designing something based on machine learning, how can you get the computer to give the right answer unless you've really understood what's going on? So this principle shows how Spotify try to embrace that when designing. Use this to help shape algorithms in human-centered ways, and try to focus on the human side of this first before they dive into the machine side of things. They write here, what does it mean to like an artist, or an album, or a playlist, or podcast on Spotify? How does the user's context shape their decision of what to listen to? What does someone need to know before making the choice of what to listen to? So by asking these questions, or even hundreds of questions, it forces them to put the actual user scenarios and user needs at the center of the algorithm.
Yeah. With one caveat, when I was reading this, because I wasn't playing devil's advocate when I'm reading these articles. First, when I was looking at it, why do they keep asking these questions to themselves? Why don't they go and ask them to users? But when you read on, they start listing the questions, and to find the answers to these questions, they have to go out and talk to people. And they assess the user feedback and identify behavioral patterns in the data. So they're both looking at qualitative and quantitative data to understand this. And it was only after they started proving the hypothesis they had based on these questions that they started to apply machine learning. So I like how they're describing that we move very slowly, actually. That is sort of what I'm getting from this. We move slowly and consistently and with intent before we apply the complex areas of the design. Yeah,
you're getting in now to the third principle that they list. Go manual before you go magical. And
right.
This is, they say here, as Spotify designers, you get to a certain stage during product development, and a typical delivery will be a wireframe or a prototype of the intended experience. But when designing machine learning experiences, it might look like it might be a set of rules that you deliver. they get the question of like, how do you prototype a personal experience? Is what they bring up in the article, the challenge of that when you've got to this point, which they say, well, you're maybe not going to go straight on to using the data at first. So they use hypotheses and start to manually build up rules that might succeed in fulfilling that hypothesis.
Exactly.
And once they've got a set of rules, or heuristics as they write in the article, they will actually maybe get the data people to build something that pulls out the data to generate that. But I'll quote another bit from the article here. If we can't achieve a good quality experience with a manual approach, applying machine learning to the problem probably won't be worth the investment.
Exactly.
So if they build up their heuristics on their questions and hypotheses, and then try and answer them themselves, and see whether there's kind of constraints or things that would work, and only when they're satisfied with that kind of self-check, that they would then probably go forward to putting the effort into to setting the algorithm loose.
Exactly. I really love how this. I'm realizing now that this article is really explaining when people say just because you can build it doesn't mean you should build it. And if you wonder what that means, you can read this article, because this is what it means. It means that you are really intentful about finding out if you should build it. I'm liking it more and more as we're discussing it, actually, because I thought I found some faults in it, but I really like where they're coming from. They're talking about speed in the end, that they're moving as fast as possible, but I really like how slowly they're moving as well.
Yes,
because that's what I'm taking away from it.
And this is for me. I mean, we started by focusing on a bit the friction side and the danger of that, but yes, absolutely. Ultimately, and they themselves say the techniques that they're describing in the article, these are all techniques derived from long-established human-centered design principles, and it's true, and you can tell that by reading the whole article. And I love the fact that they've really shown the benefits and the advantage of investing quality time, quality research to truly understand the problem and create a working solution. This is the kind of approach that I think we lack in so many aspects, especially when we're forced with the various methods of working that we use with agile and sprints and so on, where we're and skateboards for what's it called, minimal viable products. All these things that push us to do stuff quickly and get stuff out there. Whereas here we're seeing the benefit and the quality that you can get, and ultimately the better user experience you can deliver by investing genuinely in the design.
I'm wondering now if this actually is an effect of machine learning being quite complex and expensive, so that you realize that if you invest too much in the wrong solution, it will actually be very expensive in the long term, or also in the short term as well. Whereas during design, during the 2000s and 2010s, we have had so many designs that are so cheap to produce. So you can go 2 weeks and you have an idea, and another 2 weeks you have it published out there, and that's sort of what's created a lot of the problems we have in design today, where you release solutions that you haven't really checked what harm they could possibly create. But in this case, you actually have something that you have to create that is quite expensive and difficult to maintain. So you have to be really, really sure that you're doing the right thing, which actually forces you to be this careful about what you're doing.
I think it's a good point about design being cheap. I mean, we many times you're doing multiple variations of designs and A/B testing them and so on. Because it's so cheap, you can actually throw out 2 of them, or 3 of them, or whatever. Exactly. No, so I mean, they do work iteratively. They say in it that they do many rounds of some of the manual part of this design. So it's not like they do one design straight away and they throw it out. They really do take their time to iterate and to test, to see what's happening. Is it achieving what they want before taking that that next big leap into production, into release to a large user base.
Yeah.
So I think we can definitely learn a fair bit about healthy design from, not just for machine learning, but design in general, from this article about machine learning from Spotify.
Mm-hmm. I'm browsing ahead in my notes here, and I'm looking at what episode we're supposed to recommend for the show, and it's fantastic because you actually found an episode from way back, episode 66,
which was
when we also
6
featured
years
an
ago.
article. Yeah, also an article by Anthony Tseng. Was that also on UX movement? I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a classic episode.
Is it the White Rabbits episode?
Yes. And,
oh my God!
And I mean, of course, it's the epic delete undo argument, and it's the peanut butter and jam episode, where Jared Spool and Peter
Merholtz,
yes, argue about whether UX basically destroyed IA, information architecture.
Oh wow!
And peanut butter and jam comes up as the Jared analogy. It's an excellent thread. It's a classic episode.
And the epic delete undo argument is really the first and only time that you and I really argued.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That's what UX movement does to you. Hope you enjoyed today's Leak Shop, and if you'd like to contribute to funding UX Podcast, then please visit uxpodcast.com/support.
Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
Why was King Arthur's army too tired to fight?
I don't know. Why was King Arthur's army too tired to fight?
It had too many sleepless nights.
Oh.